Imagine you want to know what your customers think, but you can't ask everyone. How do you make sure the people you do ask represent the whole group? That's where probability sampling comes in. I'm Justin from Wall Strategy, and I help businesses turn research into decisions that drive growth. Let's break down probability sampling, why it matters, and the main types you should know. Probability sampling means that every person in your population has a known chance of being selected. The reason why you might want to choose this is to reduce bias and make sure that your results are more generalizable. When conducting research, it's really important to reduce bias, as we don't want to find data that just supports what our assumptions are. And so there's several key types of probability sampling that we'll get into, such as simple random sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling, and systematic sampling. Now, simple random sampling is typically the technique that a lot of people go towards because it's typically the most easiest. And this is where you generally have a population drawn out where you get to see every customer. And the way that this method goes is that there's a random chance of every person being chosen. This can be either from drawing names from a hat, having a computer generated random number system, choosing every third person, or even just choosing every other person. And although it's a very straightforward method that can minimize bias and represent a good enough population, it could be challenging to implement with a very large or even inaccessible population. But this is typically more found in areas such as healthcare or people with specific types of disease, where those are the inaccessible populations that you as an everyday small business owner might not have to deal with. Next is stratified sampling. And this is a statistical method of sampling where a population is first divided into homogeneous subgroups called stratas, and they are typically shared in characteristics such as age, gender, or income, where there's groups of people that have similar characteristics to them. And the reason why you might want to do this is in case if your customers are different in ages or generations or even gender or income, that can affect your type of personas. For example, if you're targeting a high income persona, they typically might purchase less, whereas low income personas are purchasing more, and the same messaging might not work for both groups, and you would have to tailor each messaging to those personas. And this is where stratified sampling can be useful. Another reason why you would use this method is when high precision is needed to increase the accuracy and efficiency of research findings. Unlike the last method, you would also use this in representation of rare groups such as small diseases, as I had mentioned before. You can also perform comparative analysis when utilizing this method, but that gets into a whole different kind of thing. The third probability sampling method is cluster sampling. This is a method where a large population is divided into naturally occurring groups called clusters, such as geographic areas, schools, and a random selection of these clusters is chosen, and then all individuals within the selected clusters are included in the study. The reason for this is because it is usually cost efficient and effective for widely dispersed populations, though it carries a risk of sampling error if the chosen clusters are not representative of the entire population. You typically use cluster sampling when you have a large and geographically dispersed population, there's either logistical and cost constraint, or you're unable to have a sampling frame where you're able to complete a list of every element in the population you want to study. Lastly, there's systemic sampling. Researchers select participants from a population at a fixed regular interval. Now, I know I said that stratified sampling was systemic sampling, but there's a bit of overlap. With this technique, it involves selecting a person at random intervals to represent the entire population. The difference though, even though there's some overlap, is that simple random sampling can be thorough but time-consuming for large populations. And this is where systemic sampling can help increase efficiency and be easier to conduct, but can also introduce bias if the population has a repeating pattern that naturally occurs. Now, the main reason why you want to understand your sampling method is that there's more reliable in your research than just having convenient samples who raise their hands. Additionally, this lets you calculate margin of error and confidence levels to understand how confident you can be in your research. Now, this is typically ideal for larger high-stakes quantitative studies. The challenge with this though is that it requires a good population list, also known as a sampling frame. But the challenge with this is that it's usually more expensive and can be more time consuming, and it's not always practical for small businesses, even with simplified approaches to improve accuracy. However, despite these challenges, there's always a way for small businesses to counter this. And so to recap, probability sampling is the foundation of reliable research by giving everyone in your target market a fair chance to be selected. You can trust the results from that method and make better decisions. In my next video, I'll cover non-probability sampling and when it would make sense to use that instead of probability sampling. If you want practical strategies for using research in your business, subscribe or reach out if you want a project done for you.